Yellowstone National Park is at the center of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem includes Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park, but also includes expansive areas of national forest and state and federal lands. And it's one of the largest, if not the largest, intact temperate zone ecosystems in the world. It's definitely the largest in North America. It's over 34,000 square miles. It's larger than some states. And it's probably the only place where you can see free roaming bison alongside grizzly bears and black bears and elk and moose and wolves all in the same place. So one thing that's interesting is this ecosystem represents a partnership between the Department of the Interior, which oversees the National Park Service, and the Department of Agriculture, which oversees the Forest Service. In addition, state agencies and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are involved in administering this massive expanse of ecosystem. Yellowstone National Park and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem exist today because of men like Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, who I consider utilitarian conservationists. So what does this mean? It means that these men had a spirit of conservation and saw the importance of protecting natural environments and natural resources. But their reason for conserving these resources were mainly that we need to conserve these resources so that humans, mankind, can exploit these resources for many generations. So it's interesting, while Yellowstone exists today because of men like Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, it's managed today largely as a wilderness area where the goal is to intervene and interfere as little as possible with natural processes and the natural ecology of the region. The reason it's managed like this is because of men like John Muir and Aldo Leopold. And in particular, Leopold is a very interesting man, and a man that I respect greatly. He invented or proposed what has come to be called a land ethic. And so what this is Leopold actually thought about the morality in the relationship between man and our environment. And he called for the preservation of wilderness for its own sake. It didn't have to have a utility in order to be conserved. Wilderness has its own intrinsic value. So he said in his book, Sand County Almanac, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. There's a morality encapsulated in that statement. Interesting, Leopold attended the first forestry school at Yale that was established by Gifford Pinchot. And in the early half of the 1900s, he worked for the Forest Service in Arizona and New Mexico. And later he worked in Wisconsin and became a professor of wildlife management at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And his life's writings are interesting because they chronicle an evolution from a Roosevelt-esque or a Pinchot-esque utilitarian conservationist type of mentality to this land ethic, which is also called biocentric preservationist mentality, the idea that wilderness should be preserved for its own sake. He believed in in that when you have deep understanding of the ecology, um, that what this does is it reveals that conservation based on economic utility or economic value is insufficient. We'll be revisiting Aldo Leopold a little later when we talk about wolf introduction. Um, but for the remainder of this lesson, let's take a closer look at two other species that inhabit the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The first species, bison, or American buffalo. Um, Bison are the king of North American ungulates, or hooved animals. Before Europeans settled and expanded westward in the United States, there was perhaps 40 to 60 million of these guys roaming in enormous herds throughout the plain states. By 1870, the number had dropped to 5 million, largely due to hunting and harvesting for other uses. In 1900, there was as few as 300 bison remaining in the United States. And enough people saw the value in trying to save the bison, and a lot of these people were private rancher type people, that the bison efforts were made to bring bison back from the brink of extinction, so that by 2000 there were almost 500,000 bison in the United States. But most of those bison are in captive herds. They're raised like cattle for their hides and for meat. Yellowstone is one of the few places. This map is showing the extent of bison populations in 1870 and the original range of bison. Then in 1870, how their range had contracted, and then in 1889, you just have these pockets of free-ranging bison, and one of those pockets is at Yellowstone National Park. So it turns out that Yellowstone National Park is the only place where there's been a continuous herd of free-roaming bison since European colonization. Yellowstone is a very special place. But today there is in Yellowstone there's 4,000 to 6,000 free-ranging bison that make up the herd of Yellowstone. And while this is a small number compared to the millions that used to exist in the plains, it is a very impressive sight, as you will see, to see a herd of bison roaming across the Lamar Valley or the Hayden Valley. And in July, that's mating season for the bison, so we might get some entertainment, some bison conflict, some guttural noises. Should be interesting. So when bison were driven to the brink of extinction around in 1890 to 1900, there were many reasons for that. Now bison have been hunted by native peoples for thousands of years, and sometimes they were killed in large numbers. Some native tribes would stampede bison off of cliffs into these areas that became known as buffalo jumps. But European settlers, as they pushed westward, really took the slaughter to a new level. Just unbelievable numbers of bison, and they were shot for food. Buffalo Bill Cody earned his nickname because he hunted bison to feed railroad workers in Kansas as the railroad was being built across the plains. But they were also just shot for sport or for their bones, for fertilizer, to be ground up and used for fertilizer. Or they were shot to make room for farming or to save grazing land for cattle. And they were also shot for their fur and their hides. In fact, after the beaver trade collapsed, the beaver fur trade collapsed in the 1840s, John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company started trading buffalo robes, the hides of buffalo with the fur attached to it, and and this contributed to the over hunting of bison. So one of the things about having the bison driven to the brink of extinction is all present-day bison are descendants of a relatively small number of individuals, as little as 200 individuals in the Yellowstone region. So one of the consequences of this is genetic diversity. The bison population went through what's referred to as a genetic bottleneck, where the number of individuals and thus the genetic diversity of the population is small. Another consequence is that bison have, in the past, to varying degrees in different areas, interbred with cattle. So most bison today have at least some cattle DNA in their genome. One of the things that's nice about or special about the Yellowstone bison is their genetic makeup is particularly pure when it comes to because they haven't intermingled with cattle to the extent of other bison populations. Bison, they're not just food for predators or food for humans. They're grazing animals, they're hooved animals, and when they move across the landscape in the grasslands of the plains, they actually are providing an important ecological service. Their grazing and their hoof action actually helps to maintain the health of grasslands. Another species that is native to Yellowstone and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and really defines the landscape is the lodgepole pine. So here's a picture of a lodgepole pine forest. These pine trees, this is a subspecies of a pine tree species that is widely dispersed in the American West from coastal regions to the Rocky Mountains. And the lodgepole pine is a subspecies, grows as a tree, a very tall tree with a very straight trunk. In this picture, you see that some of the lodgepoles are brown, and what's going on here are these lodgepoles are infected with a bark beetle called the mountain pine beetle. It's a native species. It's not an invasive species, and but it's thought that changes in the climate and or drought conditions increase the susceptibility of lodgepoles to infestation with these pine beetles, and these pine beetles will burrow into the bark and disrupt the flow of nutrients in the tree and ultimately kill it. Kind of like the emerald ash borer that we have back here. The lodgepole pine is a subspecies of Pinus contorta, which the lodgepole has a very straight trunk. It's a very tall, straight trunk, so it's not contorted at all. But the species gets its name from the coastal variety, which tends to grow twisted and gnarly because of the influence of coastal winds. Now, in this picture, we see in green the region, the extent of the region where lodgepoles grow, which is most of the Rocky Mountains. And so the lodgepole is interesting because one of the reasons it's interesting is because it has fire-dependent ecology. The tree is not particularly resistant to wildfires. It has relatively thin bark, so it's not like a sequoia tree, which has thick bark and that somewhat insulates it from wildfires. But the tree requires wildfires in order to propagate. Wildfires are necessary to open the cones and release seeds. And so this means that if there's too much wildfire prevention, it will actually disrupt the life cycle of lodgepoles and other species of plants which require wildfires in order for them to propagate and to exist in healthy ecosystems. So plants that have adaptations that cause seeds to be released in response to environmental stimuli like fire are called serotinous, and or this adaptation is called serotiny. The common name lodgepole, well, you can probably guess where it comes from, but it's attributed to the fact that native peoples used lodgepole pine tree trunks for teepee poles. And lodgepoles have a fire ecology, and wildfires have always been a part of the ecology of Yellowstone National Park. And forest fires are fairly common. In 1988, the park was hit with particularly bad, horribly bad series of wildfires. And here in this map, you see all the region in yellow that was burned in 1988. This map also shows regions that were burned in 1989 through 2016, in regions that burned in 88 and have burned again since then in red. So in 1988, much of the park burned. And when we go there, you're going to see evidence of these fires, these forests that burn, even 25 years later, 30 years later, 31 years later, and we will take a hike through. Well, we'll try to take a hike through a forest that's located here near the lake. And so this forest burned more recently than 1988. And so what you'll see is a scene that looks something like this, except the trees that are regrowing are not as tall, and lots of wildflowers growing in the understory, which used to be underneath the canopy of the lodge poles, now exposed to sunlight, allowing these wildflowers to bloom. So this picture that we're looking at right here, this is actually a forest that burned in 1988, and then this is a picture that was taken 25 years later in 2013. So you see the remains of trees that burned 25 years earlier still standing, and new trees, new lodge poles growing from seeds that were released during that wildfire. And so one thing that's notable here is notice these are 25-year-old trees. They are still pretty short. The growing season in Yellowstone is pretty short, so these trees grow very slowly, and they also it's a relatively arid summers and a relatively short growing season. So these trees take a long time to grow. All right, so that concludes this lesson, just a quick overview of these two really cool species that are really hallmark signatures of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem.